It is my pleasure to welcome you to our fifth FeBinar, the talks organized as part of our Year C project, which is funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Department of Humanities here at the University of Trento. FIBO has the main goal, which is exploring the multi-layered strategies and approaches applied by Greek federal states in order to help secure stability and inner cohesion by managing the different challenges posed by the league's internal and external borders in a flexible manner. Our focus are both border management policies and cultures, both top-down and bottom-up. Since intra-federal and external borders must necessarily be approached from various research perspectives and with different questions, FIBO organized two distinct series of lectures, each with another focus, one on internal, the management of internal borders by federal states, the other on external borders, crossing federal borders, ancient and modern. Both series have been initiated by the inaugural lecture delivered by Hans Beck on March the 7th, which focused on a case involving both intra-federal and extra-federal borders. The FeBinar series, The Management of Internal Borders by Federal States, aims at analyzing how the Greek federal states dealt with the problem of internal, intra-federal borders and border areas. Did border management policies aim at peaceful coexistence per se, or rather at a balance of power and stability? These and other questions we are asking presuppose other thorny issues that necessarily need to be addressed. What borders are we talking about? And above all, to what sense of belonging are these borders attached? And when it comes to regionally projected political communities, how many levels of membership do we have to deal with? Does it make sense in this case to speak of a political community boundaries, or are they situational boundaries shifting according to circumstances? Must we come to terms for certain historical phases with multiple boundaries, each associated with one of the multiple levels of memberships, in turn associated with the complex dynamics of expansion of political communities with federal orientations related to the management of sanctuaries? We look forward to hearing from our guest, Professor Hans-Joachim Gehrke, who needs no introduction, but I'll just say a few words for the younger students here in the room. Professor Hans-Joachim Gehrke is Emeritus Professor at Albert Ludwigs Universität in Freiburg im Breisgau and former professor and chair of Greek history and decan there. During the last year, he was president of the globally active German Archaeological Institute, and in 2017, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Köln. In 2019, an honorary doctorate from the University of Athens. A lot of publication, a lot of research interests, among them Mythos, Olympia, Kult und Spiele, Berlin 2012, and with Linghoff Foxal and Nino Luraghi, Intentional History, Spinning Time in Ancient Greece, and most important for federalism and ethnicity, groundbreaking in 1986, Jenseits von Athen und Sparta, das dritte Griechenland und seine Staatenwelt. His collaboration with Trento has distant roots that go back almost 30 years in his friendship with Professor Maurizio Giangiulio. I met Professor Gehrke when I was a student in Trento, where he had been invited by my supervisor, Maurizio Giangiulio. In the following years, I had the opportunity to visit Professor Gehrke in Freiburg and in Munich during my PhD and postdoc. For me, Maurizio, Giorgia, the whole group in Trento, the FIBO team, it is an honor to have him with us today. So I'm really honored to give the floor to Achim Gehrke. I see the screen was already shared, but this is not the right one, perché adesso devo fare la condivisione del PowerPoint. Quindi io la faccio da qua, giusto? Ok. Vado a schermo intero. Professor Gehrke, floor is yours. You need to switch on your mic, if it depends on that. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, it's okay. We can hear you.
Buonasera, buonasera, good evening, dear friends and colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to speak today in a FeBinar of the fascinating project Federalism and Border Management in Greek Antiquity, FeBo. I would like to thank Elena Franchi and her team very much, not only for the kind invitation, but also the friendly salutation here. I would like to begin the lecture with two preliminary remarks, with which I must ask for understanding for the choice of my topic. By the way, can you hear me well? It's okay?
It's perfect, Achim. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, it is questionable whether my example is adequate. For the question of whether and in what sense Elis can be regarded as a federal state in the narrower sense is controversial. And secondly, I'm not dealing directly and concretely with boundaries, borders, or the drawing of borders. Nevertheless, I think, and Elena has agreed with me, that the case study I would like to present here fits the program of the FeBo project. However one wants to characterize the political union of Elis, or better of the Eleans, it shows, at least before the synoikismos of 471, very clearly federal elements, as Massimo Nafisi in particular has pointed out. In addition, the question of demarcation always refers to the question of belonging. Which community you belong to or feel you belong to is not as clear as a marked border. In other words, if one does not look directly at borders, one can also determine or scale gradations and differentiations by looking at affiliations and belonging types or scales or grades of belonging. And this is perhaps more suitable for characterizing pre-modern societies than focusing on regionally defined borderlines, which were only drawn by the modern state with all its rigor. In this respect, Elis, with its complex structure, is perhaps not a bad example. My starting point is a find, surprising in several respects, made during excavations in the sanctuary of Elaitya in Olympia. Next slide. The excavations led by Georgia Khatzi and Aliki Mustaka. It is a bronze tablet of the type that is otherwise well known from laws or other official texts from Olympia. It can be dated to the first half of the 5th century on the basis of the letter forms. In my view, this is one of the most fascinating epigraphic finds of recent years. Next slide. The understanding of the difficult text has been decisively promoted by the work of Klaus Hallow, Gerhard Thür, and Sophie Minon. This is the only reason why I was able to develop further historical interpretations that are worthy of discussion and are therefore presented here for discussion. They concern the question of affiliation and belonging, especially in the relationship between Elis and Ledrinoi, Eleans and Ledrinians. Before, we had always spelled the name Ledrinoi as Ledrinoi, but as the inscription shows, we should prefer, as I do now, Ledrinoi, Ledrinians. The text is written in the Achaean dialect with some pieces of the Elean one. I will first give the translation here, asking for understanding for possible mistakes by a non-native speaker. The next slide, please. It's the edition by Klaus Halloff. I translate. Decision of the 3 judges from Pelana. As soon as the sentence has been passed, no one shall partake of common meals, nor hold a common assembly, nor bear arms in common, nor till any land belonging to the hetaeria, nor sacrifice at the seer, except at the public seers or sacrifices of the polis. If anyone does any of these things, the leader shall go into exile, and his property shall be confiscated in favor of Olympian Zeus. The largest properties before a body of 3 men, the rest before one of 5 men. In case of misconduct, each shall pay 10 minae fine. The rest, as many as were involved, shall each pay 1 min of silver fine. The fines shall all be dedicated to Olympian Zeus. Furthermore, no trial should be possible on whether the judges allow or refuse a trial. If anyone damages this writing, and if, after ascertaining with what cunning and guile he was at work, the strangers Timaeus, Pittacus, and Dexicles condemn him, he shall be liable to the severest of what is written here. But if one of the Cilicians litigates, and if then one gives justice, and we have found out by what procedure or speech that happened, he shall be liable to the severest of what is written here, whether he be a stranger or a citizen. What the Pellenians have handed down to the Ledrinians as a sentence shall be in accordance with the law and valid. This tablet shall be sacred property of Zeus. The next slide. This is only the translation. And now, again, the next slide. The text is clearly structured. A heading, line 1, is followed by prohibitions for convicted members of the hetaeria, lines 2 to 5. Penal provisions in case of violation thereof, lines 5 to 10. Namely, A, for the leader, 6 to 8, and B, for the others involved, 8 to 10. And finally, guarantee provisions for compliance with the decision, lines 10 to 18, in 4 parts. A, indemnity of the 3 judges, 10, 11. B, securing the decision, is the so-called prohibition of circumvention, 11 to 14. C, prohibition of appeal, the so-called res judicata clause, 14 to 17. Confirmation of legal force, a kind of second res judicata clause by a third party, 7:18. And E, consecration of the tablet, which is at the same time a provision for publication. My interpretation is based on the following elements, which have essentially already been worked out by the aforementioned researchers. Next slide. The tris dicasteres from Pelana, that is Pelene in Achaea, hapax legomenon, namely 3 judges, are identical with the 3 foreigners, Xenoi, Timaeus, Pittacus, and Dexicles, mentioned by name in line 13. They are comparable to the foreign judges known mainly from the Hellenistic epoch, but here they have powers that go far beyond what is known from later times. Comparable to the archaic nomothets and asymnets, they have extraordinary and definitive powers to make decisions in emergency situations of a community, especially as a result of internal strife, stasis. The community of the Ledrinians was apparently unable to deal with this situation on its own because it was too divided. This in itself indicates that the 3 judges were appointed to restore order after a serious conflict that could no longer be resolved by the community alone. This included, above all, the punishment of the group that stood in the way of this order. That had triggered the conflict, or, true in any case, that had been defeated in this conflict, and to whom one could thus ascribe the role of the guilty party, regardless of what had actually happened. In the first part of the decision, called Dokimia, of the 3 judges, prohibitions are provided that apply to this group, distinguishing between the leader, Archagos, and his followers or the other participants, with implications for the level of punishment in the case of transgression of the prohibitions mentioned. This group was obviously a heteria, so generally a tightly knit community bound together by close friendship and camaraderie, as is known particularly from Stasis contexts. The existence of a heteria is evidenced by the reference to land in its possession, Scala Etaritica, line 3-4. This belongs to the series of prohibitions, and so it is natural to refer the other prohibitions also to this heteria, as the previous interpreters have done. I consider this to be certain because otherwise the prohibitions cannot be understood at all. In this case, they could only refer to the entire Ledrinian community, which would have largely paralyzed its political religious life. However, according to the inscription, the community could still be counted on as an active factor. We are familiar with prohibitions and restrictions in public life, and with regard to the activities of officials and political bodies of the entire community, from the Athenian legislation for protection against tyranny and subversion. But here we are not dealing with a precautionary measure, but with a regulation after an attempted revolt. The aim of the prohibitions is therefore to paralyze the entire activities of the heteria concerned. It thus disappears as such from the public life of the community. It is annulled, as it were. Its members are no longer allowed to hold communal meals comparable to the syssitia and similar forms of commensality. In addition, they may no longer hold meetings and carry weapons together, for example, during processions or training. Their own farmland may no longer be cultivated, and sacrifices may no longer be made at their seer. The punishment is severe, but it only affects the group and its activities, or restricts the individuals belonging to it with regard to these, not in their existence as citizens of the community of Ledrinoi, unless this position was linked to belonging to a heteria, which cannot be completely ruled out. In any case, the prohibition of the common carrying of weapons might have at least limited their activity as hoplites. There is talk of opla in line 3. In view of the widespread, and here in Ledrinoi, also conceivable connection between military service and full citizenship, the latter would then be affected after all. They would thus have become a kind of second-class citizens. How long the prohibitions should apply is not stated in the text, just as it remains unclear for what period the extraordinary powers of the 3 judges should apply. The inscription even reveals in line 14 the name of the Hetaria, Kilikikoi, the Cilicians. This enigmatic designation only makes sense in the context if one refers to the members of the Hetaria concerned, who alone had a reason to take legal action against the decisions made by the three men. In any case, for linguistic reasons alone, the designation cannot refer to real Cilicians, but rather to a group to which one had attributed a designation connected with the Cilicians, and thus possibly with negative connotations, or group which had received this name or designation and given to itself. There are clear indications that this Hetaria was not a purely political or even a special purpose alliance, nor an informal but quite effective clique of men, but a group with institutional elements and functions. This is already suggested by the existence of common property. In addition, there were apparently communal meals, a kind of syssitia, as Gerhard Thür suggests, and it is conceivable that these were co-financed by the proceeds from the Hetarian land. In addition, there were gatherings as well as communal appearances in arms. The reference to a seer, especially in distinction from public cult activities or seers, can also be interpreted as an indication of a firmly established institution. And the fact that in addition to other members, a leader is expected could also be understood accordingly. One then thinks of the integration of possibly older groups or warrior groups into the polis, of which there are examples, especially in Tiryns, with the so-called Plati Voinoi, and on Crete with the Agellai or Hetariae. Then one would have to assume that there were several such semi-official institutions in Ledrinoi, and that they and the polis as a whole could be in a certain state of tension with which conflicts of loyalty could be connected. But that all remains hypothetical. The decision of the three-judge panel is secured and reinforced in a special way. Next slide, please. Heavy penalties are imposed on violations by the members of the Hetaria concerned. There is no right of appeal against decisions of the three judges panel on admissibility to a court. Circumvention of the decision is prohibited, nor can it be appealed against by the Hetaria members. Violation of both also carries heavy penalties. In the case of unlawful admission of an appeal, not only citizens, but also strangers are threatened with punishment, lines 16-17. This is to prevent the appeal to other foreign judges or instances, and here one must also think of Elis. The decision of the three judges is therefore legally irrevocable. Their special authority is expressed not least in the fact that everything is determined by these judges themselves. Finally, in a concluding clause, lines 17-18, the conformity to the law and the validity of all decisions of the three judges is stated. As can be seen from the wording itself, this statement goes back to a third power, beyond the Ledrinians and the Pallenians. As things stand, that can only be Elis. The safeguarding of the measures and a reference to Elis is also expressed in the fact that the tablet on which the decision is recorded, namely our inscription, is consecrated to Olympian Zeus, thus also religiously protected as a published text. It should also be noted in this context that all penalties, including the proceeds from the possible confiscation of the leader's property, go to the temple treasury of this god. This much should be said in due brevity about the new text and its interpretation. But what does it mean for the question of boundaries, borders, and affiliations or belonging with regard to Ledrinoi and Elis? A thoroughly ambivalent picture emerges. Next slide, please. Let us look at Ledrinoi first. It is a formally independent polis and is explicitly called such, line 5. This is even reinforced by the fact that in the same breath, the public legal character of its organization is emphasized, precisely in contrast to the order of the Hetaeria. The term damosios used for this refers either to public cult acts, like sacrifices, or more likely, because of the context, to public cult functionaries, in this case, seers. This is also characteristic of a polis, which was always also a religious community. Ledrinoi therefore had its own cult organization. However, the polis also had its own court system and government of justice. This is shown by the reference to legal action and decisions in legal cases in line 11, mo lesai, that means to litigate, or line 14, 15, dikatsoi. In analogy to the procedural law in other Greek polis, we must also expect in Ledrinoi that certain usually high or highest officials of the polis were responsible for guaranteeing the legal process, and that such officials therefore also existed in Ledrinoi. The fact that the confiscation of property is connected with the common term demoisis, line 6, damo temen, points in substance in the same direction, even if the term is already used as a general terminus technicus. If the Hetaeria had an institutional character, as seems likely, we can, as already mentioned, assume an internal division according to Hetaeriae as a component of the political and social order of the Ledrinians. At the same time, a clear differentiation between inside and outside emerges from the inscription. It is the existence of borders and different affiliations. Since the decision of the three judges is addressed to the Ledrinians, the following statements apply to this polis. A severe punishment is banishment, line 6, varein. That means expulsion from the political association or polis to another area beyond the borders, combined with a prohibition to return. A distinction is also made between strangers, line 13, xenoi, line 16, xenos, and citizens, line 16, vastoi, even in polar opposition. Wherever and however the territorial boundaries of Ledrinoi were drawn, it was clearly to be determined who belonged to the Ledrinian body of persons and was a citizen of Ledrinoi. The fact that the polis in Greek has the same name as the totality of its citizens, Ledrinoi, is, as in other cases, for instance in Delphoi, a record of this fact into which our translations possibly introduce a differentiation that is not entirely justified. What else we know about Ledrinoi, which will be discussed later, also fits in with these important observations derived only from the inscription. But all this is only one side of the coin. Already the provision with the demoisis, namely the confiscation, points to another entity beyond the Ledrinians. For the confiscated property does not go to their Damos or Polis, but to Zeus of Olympia. The same applies, as we have seen, to all other fines, which in normal cases, in comparable proceedings, also ended up in the state treasury. The temple treasure of Olympian Zeus, however, like the sanctuary and the rites held there, including the famous Olympic Games, was under the control of Elis, to whose union also belonged the area around Olympia itself, Pisa or the Pisatis. This transfer of the penalties is certainly not only due to the religious timidity of the three judges or the Ledrinians, especially since the tablet with the decision itself also reached the sanctuary as a consecration and was published there, thus in the territory of Elis. However, Elis' part becomes clearer above all in the form of the inscription itself, in the heading and the final injunctions on conformity to the law and publication or consecration. The heading is not written by the three judges themselves, quote of Klaus Halloff, for the judges who call themselves Xenoi in line 13 will hardly have spoken of themselves as Pelanes. Quote end. Even more important is the ending with a second res judicata clause, which in itself would be superfluous according to the preceding safeguard provisions. Mentioned here also, and quite obviously from a third party, and partly fitting the heading, are the Pellenians and the Ledrinians in line 17-18. According to the state of affairs, this third party can only be Elis. This is why Klaus Halloff attributes the heading and closing formula, quote, undoubtedly to the Elian editing of the text, quote end. Such editing can also be detected in the text of the inscription itself, which reproduces the decision of the three judges. Consequently, it is also written in the Achaean dialect, a, quote, diplomatic koine, as Sophie Minon put it. However, there are also quite a few elements of Elian. These cannot all be attributed to the scribe, but rather go back to negotiations and consultations between the Pellenians and Elians. Ledrinians may also have been part of this, and we may assume that their dialogue was close to Elian. More important, however, as already indicated, is the final clause under Elian responsibility. Since this resulted from the editorial activity of the Elians, one may also assume with Klaus Halloff that the determination of conformity with the law and of legal validity, namely the second res judicata clause, refers to the Elian legal system. Then the decisions of the three judges for the Ledrinoi would also have been legal in Elis, not only in Ledrinoi. As clearly as the affiliations were determined in relation to the Ledrinoi, they are open here in the relationship between the Ledrinians and the Elians. The Ledrinians are on the one hand independent, on the other hand integrated into Elis to a certain degree. For example, could an exile have sought refuge in Elis, or would his banishment also apply to the Elian territory? What went on in the run-up to and in the context of the decisions attested by the inscriptions can thus be summed up as follows. In Ledrinoi, there had been serious internal strife, as stasis. However, internal peace was restored, probably with the participation of Elis. The final settlement was entrusted to independent judges from the Achaean Pellene, at the latest now with the active participation of the Eleans. These judges were given extraordinary powers, and they regulated affairs in Ledrinoi. A certain group, a hetaeria, was held responsible for the unrest. Their activities were forbidden. How can we now evaluate these facts that emerge from the inscription? How can the relationship between Elis and Ledrinoi be further defined in view of the ambivalence tangible in the text? And how does this relate to the problem of borders in federal systems? To answer these questions, we need to broaden our gaze, and it is obvious to look at Elis itself and its political constitution. Next slide, please. We are quite well informed about this, especially for the time we are interested in here, late archaic, early classical period. For reasons of time, I cannot go into details here. It should be noted that the union of Elis before the synoikismos in 471 had a rather complex internal structure in which federal elements are unmistakable. In addition to a central level, next slide please, there were subunits with a certain degree of self-administration. This may already indicate that in the political traditions of the Eleans, dealing with different forms and levels of organization was tried and tested. In our context, however, it is more important that the Eleans had built up a system of alliances beyond their union, and thus beyond its borders, probably since the 6th century, or even earlier. The ancient sources use the terms perioikoi and sumakoi for this, the latter attested for the first time in an Elian bronze tablet. Next slide, please. From the last quarter of the 6th century. In this, there is a legal regulation on Olympic wrestling that concerns both Eleans and members of the Symmachie, Andra Varleon kai tas Symmachias. The wording alone shows a dialectical relationship of unity and difference, but the law is an Elean one. This reflects exactly what can also be inferred from the new inscription dealt with here. In fact, Ledrinoi also belonged to the Symmachie mentioned in the bronze tablet. The term perioikoi, but also the possible analogy of a hegemonic Symmachie, suggest that a clear relationship of dependence should be seen here. Historical parallels, however, should warn against taking an overly one-sided view. In Swiss history, for example, we know the term associated territories, zugewandte Orte, which seems to me to be quite appropriate for relations such as the one under discussion here. It takes better account of the different circumstances that have evolved. In any case, in view of the assumed complexity, a case-by-case examination is necessary instead of generalizing classifications. Especially in the case of the relationship between Elis and Ledrinoi, this is now quite possible, a stroke of luck, even beyond the new find. First of all, the location of Ledrinoi fits very well with the designation perioikoi. The site is located north of the mouth of the Alpheios, next slide please, probably in the area of the present-day villages or the towns of Pyrgos or Aios Ioannis. According to the testimony of Pausanias, Ledrinoi had been friends with Elis from the beginning. One may not give much credence to this yet. However, there are quite striking and diverse testimonies to the connection between Ledrinoi and Elis. They are mainly found in the religious cultic field, and this shows that this connection was anchored in the rituals and imagination of the agents, that is, in an area that had special significance for them and their sense of belonging. This is already visible, and here the already mentioned location plays an essential role in the fact that Ledrinoi was situated on the great processional road between Elis and the Olympic sanctuary on the so-called sacred road, or Pompike Odos. One of the central rituals of one of the most important festivals, not only for Elis, but for the entire Greek world, was thus dependent on cooperation or a good relationship between Elis and Ledrinoi. For this reason alone, the Eleans had to keep an eye on the fact that conditions in Ledrinoi were favorable for them. The Ledrinoi, for their part, had a considerable increase in prestige as a result before the entire Greek public. This was not only a source of pride, but also a reason to be on particularly good terms with the Eleans, also out of self-interest. Through long and close cooperation, such rational ties could easily take on affective and emotional traits. But the relations went far beyond that. It was connected with cults that had a very special meaning in and for Ledrinoi, and particularly at the mouth of the Alpheios. Next slide. There was a very specific connection here between the river Alpheios, or the river god Alpheios, and the goddess Artemis. This had a ritual and a mythical narrative character and was present precisely in Ledrinoi. It was probably the most important element of local religiosity. There was a temple of Artemis Alpheia there, which together with a cult image still existed in Pausanias' time when Ledrinoi was already quite dilapidated. This sanctuary is probably to be identified with the elsewhere attested in Strabo sanctuary of Artemis Alphaionia or Alphaiousa at the mouth of the Alpheios. Traditions about paintings of the Corinthians, Cleanthes, and Aragon, visible there, indicate that this sanctuary already existed in the 7th century BCE. However, the Artemis Alphaionia or Alphaiousa, central to the Ledrinoi, was also worshipped in Olympia itself with an annual festival. Significantly, Alpheios, the river god, next slide, so closely associated with Artemis in Ledrinoi, not only had his own altar in Olympia, but also one shared with Artemis. And these were included in the monthly sacrifices of the Eleans. Thus, there were further cultic relationships between Ledrinoi and Olympia and Elis, which were passed on and repeated in stories and rituals, and were therefore particularly effective. Significantly, this also radiated to the intentional history. Next slide. Ledrinoi's eponymous city founder Letrois is said to have been a son of Pelops, whose mortal remains were even kept here, according to one version. Thus, this particularly demigod, who had become the state hero, so Helmut Kyrielies, next slide please, the state hero of the Eleans around 600 BCE, and whose tomb in Olympia enjoyed central veneration, also associated himself with Ledrinoi, thus linking Ledrinoi, Olympia, and Elis. The Eleans even, next slide please, the Eleans even, and this is particularly characteristic, amalgamated the cult of Artemis Alpheia, probably to be identified with the above-mentioned Artemis Alpheionia or Alpheusa, which had its home in Ledrinoi, with the cult of Artemis Elaphia, which was important to them. 1 month of their calendar, the Elean calendar, had the name Alpheos, according to Alpheus. The massive, religious, cultic connection between Ledrinoi, Olympia, and Elis may also have been the reason why in Ledrinoi, following the Olympic model, the seers had a special significance, as the new inscription shows. In any case, Eleans and Ledrinians were very close to each other, especially in the religious field. Therefore, Pausanias's remark about the traditional friendship between Elis and Ledrinoi gains a certain relief. All this strongly suggests that we should not judge the question of the intervention of the Eleans in the stasis of the Ledrinoi solely from the point of view of power politics. Due to the extremely close ties between the two communities, a peacemaking intervention on the part of the stronger was probably more an act of friendly solidarity than political dominance. This is shown precisely by the fact that the Eleans did not settle matters from above, so to speak, themselves, par ordre du mufti, as it were, but left this to judges, at least formally independent judges from Pellana. The concrete motives cannot be clarified. What is clear, however, is not entirely indifferent to the topic of the federalism project and to my lecture today. The Elean Union, already complex in itself, created an equally complex system beyond its borders, certainly in the course of expansive processes, and in this respect also supported by power, which knew different degrees of integration, of closeness and distance. Next slide, please. Its relations with Ledrinoi were based on a special closeness, even affection. They were expressed in rites and myths in many ways, and certainly very effectively. Thus, Ledrinoi was on the one hand independent, and on the other part of Elis. It belonged to it, and again it did not. The borders in this federal system were closed and open at the same time. In this way, they probably also offered a chance to build up a larger state entity, as was already conspicuous in the context of Greek history. But at some point, following the sacro egoismo, of which this very history, the Greek history, offers so many examples, the Eleans clearly overstretched their strong position. After their disastrous defeat by Sparta in 400 BCE, the Ledrinians broke away from Elis, and not only from them alone. Next slide, please. But even that was not to be for all time. I thank you all for your attention.
Wir sind dir sehr, sehr dankbar für diesen wunderbaren Vortrag. Ich würde sagen, Q&A session is open. For those in the room, you can ask your question here. We have the mic. Potete fare le domande col microfono che abbiamo in aula. For those connected online, you have two options. On the one side, we have a Q&A session where you can write in the box, you can write your question and we will read the question. Or you can simply raise your hand and then our IT technician will switch on your mic so you can ask your question live. This is a second option, which will be very useful if we want to have a debate. So open his floor. The floor is open for questions.
Too complicated.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Just to break the ice, I will ask a question. I have many questions, several questions, but I will ask a question. This very, very interesting case of Elis, which is complicated and even more complicated as far as borders are concerned. So my question is, do we have, in the case of Elis, to cope with a situation of multi-layered borders, which are situational and depend on the different levels of membership you spoke about before. So on the one side, a union with federal traits, on the other side, more asymmetry, and then also very strong links which are more religious. And I also have a second question on this point, because I'm very curious to know if you think that there are other situations in federal Greece which can be interpreted according to this paradigm. I'm thinking of federal state in which there is a very strong police, so we are not even sure if this is a federal state or more a symmachy. There are some cases, not only the Chalcidians, but also other cases where there is a very strong police and we don't know if this is a system of military alliances with federal aspects or a federal state in the strict sense, I mean in an ancient Greek sense, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena, for these two questions. And to the first one, the relation between borders and different types of contacts or relations on other levels, as on territorial elements. So of course, as I put it, we have to be very happy that we have this example of Ledrinoi, not only the new inscription, but also what we knew before. So the evidence is very, very different. But in my opinion, we should discern between this union of Elis, the later polis, after the synoikismos, the later polis of Elis, the union, I call it union. It's not, because it's very difficult to find the precise term. It's not a federal state. It's kind of state, of course, but it's more a kind of union. So in German, like the term Verband, so a union, and this must have had concrete borderlines, as the other parts of the federal or the system of the perioikoi. So as in the case of Ledrinoi, there must have been a border because it must have been clear who is inside or outside when he is banished. So, but this is only one one side of the medal. The other is that one can transfer or one can relativize the borders by strong and by connections that are maybe stronger than the borderlines, and then the borderlines are not as important as one should think. Like, for instance, the connections between Elis and Ledrinoi I pointed out, and so there are regulations by the head of the Symmachia concerning the Symmachoi. And this is like, for instance, in the Athenian League, in the Delian and the Athenian Empire. So it's maybe a strong case of dependency and not independency. But I think in the case of Elis, in the beginning at least, when this system was developing, it was quite different. It was not so rigid as one normally thinks, as I tried to point out. The second point, and other cases similar, they have a quite parallel even in Elis in the relation to Skilus. I will study this further, but another example comes to my mind. It's the alliance or the relationship between Mantinea and the small town of Helison in eastern Arcadia. So Mantinea too is from the very beginning, it's not a polis, but you had a relatively late synoikismos, so it might be similar to Elis. One should study these. In my opinion, this is a good starting point for further research in this respect, and then we may find even more parallels even outside the union of Elis.
Thank you very much. I think there are some questions in the queue box, or at least a remark by Graham Shipley. Sebastian Scharf is reading.
Yeah, it's more a kind of a comment, not a question he wrote. He writes, just to say how much I enjoyed this marvelous paper. I agree completely that it is not just about politics.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you, Graham.
I think he's no more in the meeting because he had to leave the second message.
Okay.
I think he had to leave earlier. Any more questions online or in the room? Yes? No, you need the mic.
Sorry, I don't know, maybe I didn't understand, maybe you said it and I didn't get it, but what was the relationship between Ledrinoi and the Hetaria? Kiliki.
The Hetaria, yeah.
What was the relationship between the two of them?
I pointed out that is very hypothetical, but in my opinion, it's a kind of not only possible, but probably that Ledrinoi was structured by substructures that were called Hetariae, and belonging to Hetaria was part of being a citizen. This one can compare this to particularly to the situation in Crete, in some of the Cretan polis, where belonging to Agella or Hetaria was being part of the polis, polites of the polis. It may be similar also in early Tiryns, where we have a group of symposiasts called Plativoinoi, with a Plativoinarch, with the leader of the Plativoinoi, also being part of the the constitution, so to speak, of the polis, the early polis Tyrants. There are only that Tyrants is a very, very much disputed case. And in my opinion, it could be similar, or it can be similar could have been similar in Ledrinoi, because this hetaeria, which is concerned in the inscription, has certain institutional elements, like an official seer, like land, and like cult practices and other. I mentioned it in my talk, and so I think it's probably that the very small city polis of Ledrinoi was subdivided into, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 hetaeria, which had a strong solidarity among each other, and so also creating problems for the coherence of the whole community. And one of these hetaeria was probably too strong, or they caused civil strife, and in the end the other reacted with the help of the Elians, and the order was restored. But this is still hypothetical. One cannot show this with certainty, and it has not so much to do, I think, with the question which we are focusing now on the relationship between Ledrinoi and Elis. I hope I could answer your question.
Thank you. It was clear. I had just missed a small part of.
No, yeah, I can imagine it was a bit difficult. It's a difficult text, and there's all this legal stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any more questions? There is one more question in the room. Not in the Q&A. There are 2 questions. So sorry, if you can wait just some minutes, because we also have some questions in the Q&A.
The first one is by Christoph Lundgren. He writes, regarding the banishment, were they banished only from Ledrinoi or also Elis, and maybe maybe the Olympic Games as well? In general, many thanks for paper. As a comment, I would add that you have shown the intriguing relationship of, in my terminology, stateness and statehood, thus the interplay between policing and in and outside an entity. Many thanks. Christoph Lundgren writes.
Yes, yeah, that is the question. I pointed that out, but I think formally or legally, it is also, it's about Ledrinoi. So they had to be banished from the territory of Ledrinoi. But given the fact that the Elians are involved, the question is, could they take refuge, for instance, in Elian territory, within the union of the Elians, or for instance in Olympia, or in any other of the perioikic or Symmachoi cities of or unions of Elis? I don't know. I simply don't know. And this is part of this very interesting and very ambivalent relationship between a federal state and his allies, that are not only or simply allies, but also partly integrated within the union. For me, this is very fascinating that we have such a kind of, and we can put such a kind of questions. At least practically speaking, if I were banished from Ledrinoi, I would not have taken refuge in Elis, but go to Sparta or something like that. Yeah. Okay. There is, I see, another question in the...
Yeah, and another one from the Q&A session by Emilio Rosamiglia. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. One question. If the heading and the last clauses are an addition made by the Elians, shouldn't the dialect of these sections be free from Achaean traits? Did FeBinar point this out already?
It's simply too brief, these remarks. That is not so one cannot draw clear conclusions from these very few words, which are very, very technical.
Can we assume there was an Elian version of the same inscription? In Elian dialect?
I don't think so. I don't think so. They were able to understand even the other dialect. The other question maybe was there one and the main copy of this text, or the text itself, was to be put to the to Olympia. But was there another copy, so to speak, put to Ledrinoi? That would be of interest for the Ledrinians. And then that was only kind of a copy, because as the text mentions, the real legal text was to be exposed or published under the protection of Olympian Zeus, which was very important for this old kind of nomothesia in archaic Greece, to put the laws under the protection of the gods, or decisions under the protection of the gods, by publishing them, by consecrating them to sanctuary and publishing them there. So this is important. But maybe there was another copy or something like that on the marketplace of Ledrinoi, perhaps also in Elis. But the main text, the original, was to be put in Elis, and this was in Olympia. And this was the scripture with this dialect was the text.
Thank you. There is one more question in the room.
Oh, thank you. Good evening. I had a question about the mythological aspect, because you said that a person coming from Ledrinoi was the founder of Elis. They had common ancestors.
No, that is a bit it's a misunderstanding. I apologize for the.
Probably it was
still the relationship is we have Pelops. This is the first element of the myth historical story, or intentional history, as I put it. And Pelops is, of course, an hero of at least Peloponnesian connections and significance. He is a kind of founding father of many, by his sons and daughters, of many of Peloponnesian cities and policies. So, and then around 600, as the excavations by Helmut Kyrieleis and others in Olympia in the Pelopion have shown, they were since 600 BCE, around 600 BCE, he was worshipped as a special kind of Elian heroes, as was later on shown on the magnificent pedigrees of the temple of the Olympian Zeus, the eastern pediment. And this is one aspect. Pelops, and the bones of Pelops, particularly his shoulder, that was artificial, play, as many bones of heroes, play a great role in the intentional history of the Elians and others. And so we can see that they were not only part of the body or the whole body of Pelops was buried in Olympia or near Olympia, but also in Ledrinoi, as a certain version in Lycophron in the early Hellenistic period shows. So as in many cases, we have different variants, versions of myths, but that is possible to construct or invent at a certain time a kind of burial of Pelops in Ledrinoi shows, in my opinion, a neat connection between Ledrinoi and Olympia that is attested also by other pieces of evidence. This is one point. The other is the genealogy of Ledrois. As I mentioned, let me have just a look at the respective part of my paper. It was
Should I share the slide again?
yeah, this would be
Helps.
nice. Yes, the slide. That's fine. The slide is this is just a moment.
I'm trying to do
16, number 16, slide number 16.
So here it is. No, this is not the right one. I think
Yes, there. Yeah.
one. Okay.
And then the next is that you know that many Greek cities had founders with the same name or a similar name, and so Ledrois, it is already, as nearly all manuscripts, written with a tau, not with a delta. That doesn't matter in this respect. The Ledrois, the mythical founder of is Ledrois, and he is a son of Pelops. So there is another connection, not only through the burial, but also through this genealogy. It's not the founding heroes of Elis. The myth history of Elis is extremely more complicated, but this is a very neat connection between Elis, between Olympia and Ledrinoi, as also the cult of Artemis Alphaeonia in Olympia shows. And Olympia is, in this respect, so to speak, a part of Elis, under control of Elis. And what happened in Olympia was Elian. So there is this triangle between Olympia, the sanctuary, Ledrinoi, the polis, and Elis, the union, is very obvious. So this was my element from the myth history. I hope I could make it clearer.
Yes, many thanks.
You're welcome.
Many thanks. We have room for a last question. Sebastian, I think, has a question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the wonderful talk and for pointing our attention to this very interesting inscription. I have a question regarding line 15 of the inscription, because I think that there is probably a change of perspective in the text.
Yes.
There is a Heuremus, a first person plural.
Yeah.
Who are these we?
Yeah, we. This is part of the decision of the Pelanes. These we are the three judges. There's no other possibility. So they had a kind of abstract text, and at one point they write as we. If we, they write not in the third person, like Xenoi, Timaeus, Pythagoras, Lexicles, but we. Yeah. This has been made clear by Klaus Hallow, and mainly by Klaus Hallow.
Okay. I think we are done, Sebastian. Yeah. Thank you very much for this answer, and thank you. Oh, sorry. There is connected online. There is someone connected online who wants to ask his question live because he raised his hand. So please.
Thank you. Sorry, I got tossed out of the Zoom and then I got back in again, so it looked a bit odd for me. So if I looked a bit flabbergasted when I came back on, I had a question about the Kilikioi, which probably has to do with the lack, perhaps, of knowledge or familiarity with Elis. But I was wondering whether that had something to do with Kilene, like the city near Elis, if that would maybe complicate matters even more in terms of another border to add to it.
You mean Kilini, the harbor town of Elis, I think. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
This is discussed by Hallow and Minon for linguistic reasons. It has to refer to the Kilikioi, in the special version of Kilikikoi, which is more on a certain linguistic aspects. It's more correct than Kilikikoi. This had Klaus Hallow as a kind of a note on that. So it may seem very strange, and your suggestion is really attractive, but I think for linguistic reasons we cannot assume this very attractive solution that would fit in every respect as a part of the studies. I would love it, but it's not possible. I'm afraid.
Well, hopefully we can imagine it maybe as a Ledrinian dialect, if that will work. But
I will keep that in mind, and I will have a look on that, and perhaps I have to ask Sophie Minon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
No other questions online. So, thank you. Wir sind wirklich sehr, sehr dankbar für diesen schönen Vortrag und auch für die Debatte, die wir danach hatten. Danke nochmals. Thank you again to Professor Gehrke, and many thanks also to the audience. Save the date for our next FeBinar, which will be on November, help me, 23rd, I guess, and will be given by Petrochilos. And the topic will be again federalism and borders, but this time borders, or better border areas between Eastern Etolia and Western Locris, with a special focus on the city of Callies. Thank you again and bye. Danke, Achim. Danke vielmals. Wunderbar.
Thank you very much for also for the discussion. I enjoyed it very much, and I appreciate all what you said. It was very, very interesting to me. Thank you very much.
Wunderbar. Goodbye. Wir bedanken dich. Danke.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.
Danke auch, dass du den Vortrag gehalten hast, trotz der nicht leichten
es geht
Umstände.
Schon besser. Ja.
Also wirklich, wirklich wunderbar. Danke nochmals.
Ja.
Und ich schreibe dann.
Ich schreibe dir auch gleich eine Mail.
Ja, okay.
Ciao, ciao.
Gut. Tschüss, ciao. Danke nochmals.
Ciao.